Can the Baltimore Ravens give Lamar Jackson a perfect offensive system? We talk about that. Candidates for the Ravens offensive coordinator position and more coming up next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Ravens podcast, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, as always, Kevin Ostricker of Ravens Wire. We are here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here with us today, tuning in, making us your first listen. We're free and available everywhere you get your podcasts, all platforms, including in video form on YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And we're back here as we continue to kind of usher out the Greg Roman era and wait on what the new offensive coordinator situation will be in Baltimore. Here to talk about that with me and maybe what the perfect system for Lamar Jackson could be, and if the Ravens can give that to him, is Spencer Schultz from Baltimore Beatdown, another Taco Tuesday. And Spencer, I know we've talked for feels like years about Greg Roman and his fit as the Ravens offensive coordinator, but the Ravens officially moving on. It just felt like a move that kind of had to be made.
Yeah, for sure. Roman had a pretty long tenure as the Ravens offensive coordinator, 4 years. Usually you don't see guys go for too much longer than that. And while I do feel that the Ravens definitely had their fair share of hiccups, we really never got to see a full force offense from the time Ronnie Stanley went down in Baltimore back in 2020, when Stanley ends up missing time. Then suddenly you have to platoon at the right side. Then that causes you to feel uncomfortable going with 5-man protections. And you never really had backs that you felt super great about in pass pro anyway. So then suddenly you have to use a guy like Pat Ricard or a Nick Boyle on the field all the time. Then 2021 happens and you're without Stanley. You end up being without Patrick McCary and Stanley at times. You don't have J.K. Dobbins. You don't have Gus Edwards. You don't really have running backs that you feel confident in any part of the pass game. And you can't use your 5-man protections. Then you finally get your offensive line right in 2022. And then Rashad Bateman, finally the first time you feel like you have a real ISO receiver that you can stick on the backside of a 3-by-1 set and ask to go win or force the defense to cheat over to that side to give you some number advantages. You get 3 weeks of that. The Ravens kind of light up some defenses with it. And then he goes down. Mark Andrews gets banged up, and your backs, you're again still trying to incorporate into the pass game a little bit. It feels like you're limited what Gus Edwards can do in the pass game, and J.K. Dobbins even as well. So never really got to see a healthy version of Roman's offense, and since really the early part of 2020. But at the same time, I think he shot himself in the foot. It feels like he wasn't given a lot to work with in the receiver room at times, which is what I think kind of gets lost in translation. But at the same time, he babied those receivers, those inexperienced guys, a little bit too much. And really the only continuity they had from their skill position players over the last 3 years is Mark Andrews. When you talk about the running back room, when you talk about Marquise Brown leaving, when you talk about Rashad Bateman being in and out of the lineup, Devin Duvernay kind of being another constant that takes a leap forward a little bit, and then, he's out of the lineup as well. Sammy Watkins is brought in, then leaves, then comes back. Demarcus Robinson comes in. You had guys like Seth Roberts at one point. So just a lot of mix and match, and it felt like it ended up with Greg Roman being super conservative at times in the pass game. They ran the all-sits route, probably trying to give my best actual guess 65 to 75 times over the last couple of years, where it's kind of just a 2-by-2, and you have all 4 receivers go run a hitch. And if one of those guys doesn't get leverage, then Lamar Jackson or Tyler Huntley takes off, and defenses feel like they can really bite into that. And that was the grand irony of Demarcus Robinson's double move for a touchdown, little hitch and go, was that it was going to look like an all sits. And in the playoffs, it's time to break your tendencies. We saw the Bengals do some really nice tendency beaters this past weekend as well. So Roman did some really nice things. He also, didn't always get dealt a full hand of cards to work with. And it, at the same time, didn't really feel like enhanced the group a ton, especially outside of the ground game when they felt like they were down a couple guys or didn't have their primary guys in. But I think he had a nice tenure. I think he broke many records and did some nice things in Baltimore, had some very fun outcomes of games. And I think that a lot of people get really uncomfortable about the conversation of Lamar Jackson's MVP season and Greg Roman getting some credit for that. But at the same time, they ran an offense that no one had ever really run in NFL history, with the elements of option and the GT bash and the veer and all of those things having such a primary part of that offense, and the heavy personnel they used really has never been seen in the NFL before. We now see some other teams starting to use those elements. The Bills sprinkle it in, the Bears, and whoever else, the Cardinals have some of those things going on. But I think it was really cool in 2019 what he did. And, just felt like maybe if the Ravens could have stayed a little healthier, we might have seen a more explosive offense and something that got them a little bit deeper, but they didn't. And that's part of football. We see guys without, the Bengals right now are down 3 of their offensive linemen that they had coming into this season. They had 15 weeks of the same 5 guys. Suddenly they have 3 new starters, and they're able to figure it out a little bit. So I think that was Greg's downfall, that he wasn't able to figure it out a little bit and didn't really ever get back into that great rhythm that they had in 2019 or parts of 2020. We saw some explosive outputs in 2021 and the beginning of 2022, but just never really a consistent factor. And it felt like fans definitely felt robbed of the experience that they wanted to see from Lamar Jackson and a high-flying offense. And the Ravens iteration was more so, hey, let's be the first to score 20 and try and keep the other guys under 20. And I think that fans felt a little bit disappointed in that, but that is kind of John Harbaugh's football. So now we open it up to the world of what is the next iteration of John Harbaugh's football. We've seen Gary Kubiak. We've seen Cam Cameron. We've seen Mark Trestman. We've seen Greg Roman. Really the only guy that they've brought in that wasn't a primary kind of run and throw play action off of it guy was Marty Morenweg. And that was probably the worst iteration of any of those offenses, and bottomed out and had to have Greg Roman's offense come in. So now we're going to see the Ravens open it up, and curious to see where they go from here. And hopefully they follow suit like they did defensively, bringing in a younger guy with a little bit of college concepts and some of that experience to help evolve this team a little bit and continue to change. And I think that's what, in order for Harbaugh to be successful and chase that next Super Bowl, he needs to do.
Yeah, and as we're kind of ushering out this Greg Roman era, obviously, yes, you got to give him credit where it is due. The 2019 offense was historic, not just for the Ravens, but league-wide. They broke multiple league records that year. But I know then the questions of the play calling, and for this year in particular, the red zone offense, some of the situational awareness, a lot of stuff contributing. But now the Ravens have an opportunity to reimagine, reinvent their offensive system. And obviously, who hopefully will be the quarterback of that is Lamar Jackson. John Harbaugh saying that Lamar will have some input into who is the next guy, and that he's talked to Lamar about the situation. But I know, Spencer, people want to see Lamar kind of be able to spread his wings on whatever this next offensive system actually is for the Ravens, and not have him be limited and have it play to all of his strengths, not just some of them, which a lot of people think that was. And there have been plenty of conversations about, a pro style offense. And first of all, what it even is, but if it should be a pro style offense for Lamar, what is the next offensive system? And if the Ravens can give him kind of like the offensive system of his dreams. So Spencer, do you think the Ravens can give him the offensive system of his dreams? And what do you think that would be for Lamar Jackson?
Well, I always kind of default back to the same answer. In my opinion, the best offense is every offense. I think that especially with a quarterback that's so dynamic as a rusher, you need to be able to go under center. You need to be able to utilize option run game and RPOs. You need to be able to have a straight drop pass game. I think you need to be able to incorporate motion against different opponents. The short way of saying it is that the best offense has answers for every defense and is able to force a defense into bad looks. Again, to give an example from what we saw yesterday, the Bengals knew that if they motioned from Teron Johnson's side across the formation, that Teron Johnson, their very tiny nickelback, would then motion to be a nickel linebacker. Then they would run power at him. They would have a guard pull into a nickel in the box. And they ran right downhill on the Bills, doing that quite a bit. So being able to have answers is the best offense. And again, I don't think that the Ravens always had answers under Greg Roman with being able to expose certain elements of pass game and attack some of those areas. Lamar Jackson does really love to throw over the middle of the field. Say what you want, but that is not looked at, I think, in the same context that it should be. Throwing over the middle of the field is the most difficult area to throw over. There's more traffic, there's more defenders, there's more reads to make, and I think he does an outstanding job doing so. And I think that's an element that does have to stay because he is an unquestioned top 5 passer over the middle of the football field. We've seen him take some strides, driving to the ball to the sideline, working on his feet and his base and being able to torque the ball and drive it. And I think he can make every throw for sure. But I think, again, there needs to be an element of allowing him to work over the middle of the football field where he can process so quickly and put defenders in conflict. So, again, I think that incorporating a little bit more under center offense, turning his back, allows him to have less pressure on him snap to snap. I think that when you get into these games where he's using a lot of the option concepts or doing a lot of full field reads or a lot of, pass concepts that are relying on him to make decisions, it can be mentally tasking at times, as opposed to, hey, let's go under center a little bit and go boot and run what Kevin Stefanski runs or Sean McVay runs a ton. That helps a quarterback get into a little bit of a rhythm. You move them, get Lamar Jackson on the move is always a good idea. So a little bit more of those elements. But at the same time, I think that someone needs to be able to retain a lot of what they were doing in the run game and from pistol and from some of these, it doesn't have to be as high of a portion of 22 and 12 and 13, but those things allow him to be so successful. He is one of the most dynamic rushers, not among quarterbacks, but in NFL history. When you look from an analytical standpoint at success rate or EPA or broken and missed tackles forced or yards before carry or yards after contact or explosive run percentage, any way you cut it, he is one of the best runners ever. So removing that or denying that is, I think, shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. So they need more answers from under center. I think that the drop back pass game in known passing situations could move a little bit forward. I think that they could also stand to just simply dial up a little bit more screens again to work defenses laterally and take some of the pressure off of him in a very basic sense. But at the same time, they need somebody who's going to make guys miss after the catch. They have lacked a yak monster. They've never had someone where it feels like he can dump the ball off underneath or, get that guy a screen or get that guy on a shallow or a drive or some sort of underneath concept and let them go to work. So I think that bringing that type of person into whatever offense will allow less pressure on Lamar Jackson and allow him to kind of play a little bit more free and pick and choose the moments where he does need to play at a really high mental level, which he can do so often. So I kind of looked at Matt LaFleur's offense as an example of a lot of those things going on. And I know they didn't have a super successful year this year, but they incorporate power, they incorporate zone, they incorporate under center boot. I think they do some full field reads and get the ball out of Aaron Rodgers' hands pretty quickly at times too. So that's an offense I really like. It does have the elements of Sean McVay's offense. The Ravens have interviewed or are scheduled to interview Zach Robinson, who's under McVay. And I would imagine they want to see Bobby Slowick as well, who's from under Kyle Shanahan and does some of those things. So, simply the best offense for Lamar Jackson is just one that's going to do everything and take a little bit of pressure off of him by having some more plays that ask less mentally.
Right. And I think the Ravens can give him that. I think they can give him that perfect, for him, what would be a perfect offensive system where you mentioned it, have the answers for everything, but they don't have to tear everything down and start from scratch. I think at least running game wise, they have a foundation there, but now it's, can you add and can you build upon that? And whether this is a pass minded offensive coordinator, we've seen a lot of the trend being interviewing pass game coordinators. We have, Chad O'Shea, who I interviewed on Monday officially. It was the report, wide receiver coach over there in Cleveland. He was with New England for almost a decade there, over a decade actually. So there is that kind of trend. So I think the Ravens can give Lamar Jackson that perfect offensive system for him to work with. But obviously the question is Lamar going to be in Baltimore in 2023? The hope, obviously, for a lot of people is yes, but we're going to continue monitoring that situation. But coming up next on Locked On Ravens, we'll talk a bit about the candidates who were reported to interview and the other ones that we have in mind as well for the vacant offensive coordinator position in Baltimore. So be sure to stay tuned. So let's talk about on Locked On Ravens. But first, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And the NFL playoffs are here, and we're really excited to tell you about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the number one sports book in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads to player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. And I was just perusing the FanDuel site, and I saw they have a LeBron tab, just a LeBron tab It's for LeBron breaking the all-time scoring record, in which game he will actually score his 38,388th regular season point. You can bet on the Knicks game on January 31st plus 7,500. He's close to it. I might be looking at that OKC game on February 7th. That's plus 130 odds, but who knows what happens there? You can go to FanDuel, bet on that. There's so many possibilities for FanDuel, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So football fans, don't miss out. Place your first ever $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. We return. It's our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still here with Spencer Schultz of Baltimore Beatdown. And Spencer, we've already seen almost 10 names listed out for the Ravens, whether it has been reported requests or guys that the Ravens have on their radar. Jeremy Fowler's been putting out a lot of those names, other reports coming in here and there from other people as well. You mentioned Zach Robinson over there in Los Angeles, who the Rams offense in 2022 was not great whatsoever, but in 2021 they had the number one pass offense in the league in their Super Bowl year. You also have Chad O'Shea, Jeremy Fowler also reporting that Eric Bieniemy, the Chiefs offensive coordinator, Frank Reich, also Byron Leftwich are on their radar. T. Martin and James Urban could be getting internal looks there. Other ones, you have Vikings pass game coordinators. You have it's the pass game coordinator trend, it seems like, for the Ravens. Do any of the candidates that have been reported so far for the Ravens stand out to you? Do you have like a top three? Is there anyone you don't like on that list? What's your overall sense so far with the names?
Yeah, it seems like the Ravens are definitely diving into a lot of pass game coordinators. Zach Robinson, Chad O'Shea. They've got quarterback coach Dave Canales from the Seahawks, pass game coordinator Brian Angelicchio from the Vikings, and then, of course, Frank Reich, who has a ton of pass game expertise, Eric Bieniemy, who does bring some elements of both, and then Byron Leftwich, a former quarterback himself, who obviously has been with Tom Brady in a more pass-heavy offense. So I think among those names, you're definitely going to go look at Zach Robinson, who's a hot name. And I think that it's difficult. We get into these questions and these perspectives of who do you want the Ravens to bring in? Who do you want but I don't think we can really answer the question of, especially when it comes to these guys that haven't called an offense maybe, or especially not in a couple of years, what is their offense? Is Zach Robinson just Sean McVay? No, he's going to have some of his own wrinkles, but we don't know what those are yet. We don't know what he would do with Lamar Jackson necessarily. So I think it's a little bit of a spray and pray situation from the fan perspective, and not really knowing the finer details of what Brian Angelicchio would have in mind for Lamar Jackson, the Baltimore Ravens, and their iteration of what John Harbaugh wants. We heard John Harbaugh talk about in their press conference that they have their offensive identity, but they're open to new ideas of how to execute that offensive identity. And to me, when he says we have our offensive identity, it is running the ball downhill, throwing play action off of it, and then having a separate kind of drop back game for known passing downs or when you feel like you can exploit a defense a little bit. So within that, Frank Reich is someone who's interesting and is someone who's looking to revamp his image or revamp his confidence after a tumultuous ending in Indianapolis, after it felt like they had so much going for them, especially in the Andrew Luck years, and then even transitioning into Phillip Rivers. So tough time for him there, and kind of reminds you of Gary Kubiak, a guy that, the Ravens brought in, that was a former head coach that had offensive expertise and had that kind of defined idea. And if you want that pro style offense, that is Frank Reich. And he is going to be the one that's going to ask Lamar Jackson to make full field reads and all of those kinds of things. But I think it's interesting. Frank Reich's a guy that was aligned with Doug Peterson in Philadelphia, comes in and has a really strong situation in Indianapolis quarterback wise, then bounces around a little bit. I think that when you look at Doug Peterson and look at some of his disciples, those guys have done very well for themselves. You got one in Philadelphia who's doing some pretty darn good things right now and could very well find himself hoisting a Lombardi trophy at the end of this season. So I'm not very intrigued by Byron Leftwich at all. I think that the Ravens should steer clear of Leftwich to get to the antithesis of that question, I suppose. He has been very stubborn on record in terms of utilizing play action, in terms of utilizing a lot of different analytical advantages, and feels like that he was just not a big fan of getting out of his own way in any shape or form. Feels like he thinks he's the smartest guy in the room in a lot of ways. I do think Eric Bieniemy deserves a chance. I mean, he's been under Andy Reid for so long at this point, and if you want someone to soak up offensive knowledge from and put a quarterback in that position to take some of the pressure off of them while also putting them in a position to succeed, no one does it better than Andy Reid. And for Andy Reid to entrust Eric Bieniemy with his offensive coordinator duties for so long, Eric Bieniemy has been the play caller the last couple of years. Andy Reid isn't play calling. I'm sure he has input. I'm sure he's on the channel, and I'm sure he maybe nixes some decisions here or there, but ultimately Bieniemy does feel like a guy that has something to prove. Feels like he has wanted a head coaching job for so long and interviewed for so many, and that would be a chance for him to get out from under Andy Reid and run his own offense a little bit more so. So I think he's a super interesting one as well. So to me, the guys that really stand out are that they've interviewed so far, at least, are Zach Robinson and Frank Reich, as well as Eric Bieniemy. So those three guys, I think the Ravens will take pretty seriously. If I know John Harbaugh at all in what his history has been, I would say that he's going to favor a Frank Reich, who is a former head coach, who is experienced, who has been around the league a little bit longer. It seems like that's always been Harbaugh's MO. He wants guys that have kind of had that chance and been around and experienced things and come from a little bit of a wiser, older, more experienced perspective. So I think that if Frank Reich is willing, I think John Harbaugh is going to give that a pretty close examination. And if that conversation goes well, I wouldn't be shocked to see Frank Reich be the next coordinator.
Yeah, I think Reich is definitely on my short list. Bieniemy would be, I think, really cool for them, especially because I also think he deserves an opportunity. Him being there in Kansas City for so long and them being as successful as they have. There are the questions of how much of it is Andy Reid, how much of it is Bieniemy, how much of it is even Patrick Mahomes. But I think he deserves a shot. The question, though, is does he want to make a lateral move to get out of Andy Reid's shadow for maybe a year or two to run that offense? But he's talented, a very smart offensive mind, so we'll see what happens there. But coming up in our final segment, we'll talk a bit more about other candidates. We'll talk about John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta and more, so be sure to stay tuned. Still a lot to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. We're back here, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Olshaker still here with Spencer Schultz. And Spencer, we talked a bit about the reported candidates so far, but there are a couple other names that haven't necessarily been reported maybe yet for the Ravens that I think would be pretty good options for them. I know the one that everybody's talking about is Bobby Slowick, someone you talked about in the first segment, who could be a really intriguing option for them coming from that Shanahan tree over there in San Francisco, who they are in the NFC Championship game right now. So what to you, Spencer, makes him such a potentially attractive option? And do you have any other names you maybe want to see the Ravens give a shot in an interview?
Definitely. Well, the number one reason is his attachment to Kyle Shanahan. And again, I think that it's difficult to look at someone who has never called plays in an offense and say, oh, I want this guy. Oh, I know what this guy is going to do. But his attachment to Kyle Shanahan, who, again, you look at Eric Bieniemy, you look at his attachment to Andy Reid, you look at Zach Robinson, his attachment to Sean McVay, you look at Bobby Slowick, his attachment to Kyle Shanahan, and your hope is that as the pass game coordinator of the 49ers, that you feel like Greg Roman was probably a top two or maybe even the top run game mind in all of football, especially at the NFL level, but maybe even all around, the entire sport, and especially the higher levels, college football. So the hope is that the other guy, Kyle Shanahan, is the one that marries the pass game to the run game through play action a little bit more effectively, is able to work spacing a little bit better, is able to put defenses in conflict a little bit more and exploit things and understand how to identify and exploit different matchup disadvantages. So you would hope that because Slowick is installing that, most likely that's typically what a pass game coordinator is going to do, is take Kyle Shanahan's playbook and vision and be in charge of actually administering it, breaking it down for the quarterback's coach, the receivers coach, the tight ends coach, the pass game coach, the running back coaches, and being the delegate of that. So to have that expertise of Kyle Shanahan's offense, I think Slowick has been with Kyle Shanahan for about a decade now, despite being really young. I think he's only 35 or 36. That time with Kyle Shanahan, you hope he can soak up a ton of the ability to use the run game to open up the pass game a little bit more than we saw the Ravens do at times, and be a little bit more creative in that sense, and using tight ends in a more creative way as opposed to just using them as kind of a matchup weapon. So I think that Slowick, the idea behind him is that he has soaked up enough of that Kyle Shanahan genius and understands how to implement that pass offense. So again, I think that when someone hasn't called plays like a Frank Reich or a Byron Leftwich, it's tough to go say, hey, this is what that offense will be. I know that for a fact. That's why I want this guy. It's more so just the attachment to Kyle Shanahan that intrigues you. And the Shanahan tree, therefore the McVay tree, has had a ton of success lately.
Yeah, and other names that I've seen people mention, Joe Brady is someone who people might want. You also have maybe even Nathaniel Hackett, which I know would maybe be a bit controversial based off of what happened in Denver this past year. But in Green Bay, he was doing very well over there with Aaron Rodgers under Matt LaFleur. Or either of those names or anybody else, guys you have your eye on?
I definitely have been a big fan of Joe Brady and what he does in empty sets and using 5-man route concepts. I think that Joe Brady was a really bright mind, and maybe he did get a little bit too much credit for having 2 of maybe the top 3 or 4 best NFL receivers at LSU at the same time, in addition to a quarterback who's really darn good and a couple of other really talented players like Terrace Marshall, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, a couple NFL offensive linemen, all in the same team. So at the same time, he's definitely had a chance to go up to Buffalo and be around Josh Allen, see how, what Ken Dorsey's version of that offense is, but not sure that there was a ton to soak up. It felt like the Bills' offense, especially once Allen's elbow injury took place, took a step back. Their lack of a run game, their inability to take advantage of Stephon Diggs at times, especially in key moments, and find some clear-cut areas for him. So Joe Brady, like what he's done in terms of outside of that. Who was the second one you mentioned? I'm sorry.
Nathaniel Hackett.
Hackett. I think the Ravens would generally avoid Hackett. I think they are looking for a more positive, less controversial situation. Hackett, I would be lying if I said I was an expert on his offense, but I think that the Ravens, after the Greg Roman saga, are probably going to steer clear of anyone that's going to disrupt the fan base that much. I think that is the kind of minimum, that noise that they take in, and I think that the noise probably did slightly impact the decision for Greg Roman to part ways. It gets to the point where, people are making comments to him going in and out of the stadium on game day, things like that. So I think they're looking to avoid any immediate scrutiny or pressure. I think that they're at a little bit of an impasse in that, and it's not going to alter their decision that much. But I can see them meeting with Nathaniel Hackett on getting a feel for what his offense is. At this point, they're supposed to meet with allegedly about 10 guys. And we know that according to BaltimoreRavens.com back in 2014, when they hired Gary Kubiak, that they met with over 30 different candidates. So I think they're going to do their due diligence. And I think a main reason for that is it's the same reason, you meet with guys in the NFL draft to a degree. You want to understand what they're doing, what they're going to try to do against you. Plus, you want to hear any creative ideas they might have that you can steal a little bit. Any little bit of action that you might be able to say, okay, we're not going to go with this guy, but we did like that nuance that he brought. And it might be a very 30,000-foot general concept, but something that is put in a refreshing way or a direction that you haven't quite thought of before. So I think they would interview Hackett, but I don't think they're going to go with Hackett.
Right. It's playing chess, not checkers, when you're talking about interviewing all these candidates. And speaking of chess, not checkers, John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta had their end of season press conference. I know people kind of refer to these things as the liars' luncheons. How much of it is GM coach speak? How much of it is actually real stuff they're putting out here? But I know a lot of people, Spencer, including myself, went away from that feeling, I think, a lot more confident in the direction of the team. I think John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta had a lot of good, constructive things to say about why the season went the way it did, future plans. Was there anything that stuck out to you? I know the wide receiver room, the cornerback room were things that were discussed. Draft picks, obviously Lamar was talked about as well. But what were your big takeaways from that press conference?
Really just the receiver room. And that wasn't the Liars Luncheon. The Liars Luncheon is usually right before the draft. And that's
it's a specific one.
Yeah,
right,
usually
right.
that's
okay.
People refer to that one where he goes and says, I'm really confident in our guys. I like our guys, talking about the receiver room, and then they go draft Rashad Bateman with their first round. So, I think that for all of that talk as well, Ravens don't lie as much as people think they do. Maybe in season with some of the injury stuff, it seems like they basically said, Rashad Bateman's going to be out a couple weeks, 2 days before the trade deadline, so that teams that they're negotiating with or trying to spark a trade with aren't feeling like, okay, we can take the Ravens to the cleaners knowing Rashad Bateman's going to be out. So I think there's a little more strategy in the in-season talk, but last year they were pretty upfront. We're going to rebuild the offensive line. That's primary focus number one. And what did they do? Went and rebuilt the offensive line. They bring in Morgan Moses. They draft Tyler Linderbaum. They bring in those 2 new starters. They have Juwan James in place as well to make sure that they've got someone to, again, go further in that competition. They also draft Daniel Faalele as well, who didn't shine this year, but did get some playing time too. So I think that when you hear John Harbaugh say we're going to have a new wide receiver room next year, I don't think that's hearsay or a lie. I think that they are looking at that room saying, okay, this has gotten out of hand. You also have Rashad Bateman, who now has screws in his foot or whatever the situation is. I think they were even unclear themselves on whether or not he had screws in his foot because there's multiple routes to go with Lisfranc. But to digress, you don't want that guy to have all the pressure on him at this point. James Prochet hasn't shown to be a guy that is going to, clear out of being a day 3 guy. Tylan Wallace hasn't emerged as someone that looks like they're going to be a factor on an NFL football field as a wide receiver. Demarcus Robinson, I think the Ravens should bring back, but he, again, isn't someone that you want to be relying on as your primary guy. Sammy Watkins is not going to be a part of the Ravens' plans. So when you look at it, Devin Duvernay as well, guy going into his 4th year, did some nice things, but still hasn't shown, hey, he can go beat man coverage. He can go win isolated a little bit. He had some nice moments, especially when they stuck him in some trips bunches. When they did have Bateman on the field, that's where he scored all 3 of his early touchdowns. But you need an X, you need a Z, you need an H, and you probably need 2 guys that can go win isolated in that on-ball X role. So I think that they're going to look the veteran route a little bit at this point. And you go look at what happened with Amari Cooper last year. The Browns are able to acquire him for a 5th-round pick. And that's a guy that would have made a huge difference. Not that you can't go make every trade. I'm not saying maybe the Ravens should have traded for Amari Cooper. Sometimes, they call one team, those 2 teams agree on something and it's over and you had no idea about it. But getting a deal like that on a player that a team is looking to move, that's in that kind of 3rd contract area, of course, DeAndre Hopkins, you're looking at the Bucs receivers, Chris Godwin or Mike Evans if Tom Brady doesn't come back and those guys still want to go somewhere else and try and win, things of that situation. So that the capable, still within their kind of prime peak veteran, maybe not at their peak or at their prime, maybe not 26 years old, but maybe 28, 29 years old. I think the Ravens have to look in that direction, and I think that's what they indicated. So, it's a shame. I do think that they had the right perspective of that the wide receiver market has a little out of control, having to trade a 1st and a 2nd round pick and pay a guy top of market in order to get that wide receiver that is that game changer at that X position for you. But in order to take advantage of that kind of market inefficiency, you have to hit on them. And they didn't. They didn't go get a guy that was able to be, number 1, healthy, and number 2, consistent in winning one-on-one. So we got a little bit of that Rashad Bateman, but I think that room does look good and look in that position. And what do you hear? What else do you hear John Harbaugh say? I mean, look around the rest of the team. Cornerback 2. Okay, but you do have Marlon Humphrey. You do have really good safeties. You can help hide that corner. The edge room, you feel okay with. Tyus Bowser played well. You got David Ojabo coming back for year 2. Odafe Owe played his best football at the end of the season after kind of struggling and not having a defined role. And hey, Justin Houston said he wanted to be back and was cool when you tagged him for super cheap. Plus he's a Locked On Ravens legend. So, then where else do you go look? Left guard. There's really nowhere else, especially on offense. If you have Lamar Jackson locked down, you've got your backs coming back healthy. Neither of them had a bad injury coming back from those injuries. You could maybe stand to add another back in the draft or something. Tight ends, you've got, 3-4 guys that you really like locked down. Offensive line in a good place. So wide receiver, it's time. That's how you round out into form. And what did the Eagles do? We talk about the Eagles. What did they do? They went out and got that big name guy that took them over the top in the wide receiver room. They already had their backs. They already had their tight ends. They already had their offensive line. They had a Devontae Smith in place. But I think that Rashad Bateman can realistically give you, 1,000 yards, can be a guy that, wins for you as an X or a Z or a slot a little bit. So look at the Eagles. Look what they did. They went and traded it. If you could maybe swing a position where instead of trading just a 1st-round pick and a 3rd-round pick, but let's say you were able to go trade your 1st and a 5th or a 4th this year or next year for DeAndre Hopkins and the Cardinals 3rd or 2nd or something like that. So a little bit of a trade back and give the Cardinals your 1st-round pick. Something like that I think would be really interesting. The Cardinals do have a pretty high 2nd, so it might not work out exactly, but something of that nature to put you in that position because it's time. And I think that as much as the fans want that consistent kind of 1,100, 1,200, 13-yard receiver, clearly Eric DeCosta has been chasing Ozzie Newsome's white whale. He drafted Marquise Brown with his first-round pick and then drafted Rashad Bateman 2 years later with one of his others. So they're trying. They're throwing plenty of capital at it. They're spending. They just haven't gotten it the way they want it, and it's time to figure the thing out and have a balanced offense that can hit you with the run, hit you with the pass, take a little pressure off Lamar Jackson if you bring him back. If not, you're probably going to have a rookie that you need to give some horses or else he's going to immediately drown. So I think that's the primary takeaway from the presser for me.
Well, and I think we're forgetting the most important part is that the wide receiver room. The Ravens signed Andy Isabella to a futures deal. I mean, how excited. For those who don't know, Spencer is Andy Isabella's biggest. You will not find a bigger Andy Isabella fan than Spencer. I mean, how excited were you when you heard that news?
Yeah, the guy just really deserved to be drafted over DK Metcalf. I'm sure the Cardinals were very happy with that decision. A real dynamic threat, Andy Isabella, who couldn't even give us a jet sweep touchdown or something of the sort. But I think the best question possible, will Andy Isabella score a touchdown in 2023? And I'm going to go with a nice sturdy no, not on the Baltimore.
Because you predicted he would this year. You thought the jet sweep would have been the one.
I think the time has passed, and if he can't get it done in the couple opportunities he had, I'm over it. All right,
well, maybe he'll be like another practice squad guy they can throw out for a week, and then he scores and proves everybody wrong. But Spencer, one last thing for you. We have an early mailbag question from Troy Dabadanza, who says, what are the odds that Lamar gets a percentage-based contract? Say he gets a 5-year, 15% annual cap, 12% fully guaranteed. If he's looking to be a trailblazer, that would get it done, right? So I guess this is like his contract scales with the cap every year. So I guess he would sign a 5-year deal where, depending on the large cap number, like the full cap number for a specific team, it would go up based off of how much teams had to spend cap wise. Is that something that you could see happening? It'd be very unprecedented.
It would be. I don't think Lamar Jackson's looking to be unprecedented. I just think he's looking for at least $200 million guaranteed.
Yeah, it feels like that's what it would be. So we'll see how the situation plays out over the course of the offseason. But Spencer, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for hopping on. Please tell people where they can find your work and what you are working on as we get it. It is draft season for the Ravens, I'd call it, but we're getting into that time of the year.
Definitely. You can find me on Twitter at Ravens for Dummies. You can find articles at BaltimoreBeatdown.com. You can find the Baltimore Beatdown podcast with myself and Jake Luke, wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find me again on Twitter at Ravens for Dummies, breaking down Anthony Richardson tonight, getting after quarterbacks a little bit. Until Lamar Jackson's locked up, I'm going to be prepared on those quarterbacks and make sure that we're not feeling left in the dark if the Ravens are to tag and trade Lamar Jackson, which doesn't feel impossible at this point.
Right. So be sure to check out Spencer's work below. More Andy Isabella talk. Obviously, you can check out his work. It'll all be down there. But that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for tuning in to Locked On Ravens today. When we get back here tomorrow, it's more Ravens talk. So be sure to stay tuned for that. And I will see you right back here tomorrow.